Alton was a 40-year-old fit and experienced cave diver. He loved the peaceful feeling he got from cave diving. Diving to a greater depth and entering a narrow cave was a walk in the park to him when all his diving friends found it to be extremely nerve-wracking. In other words, he loved a good adrenaline rush pumping through his veins. The man rarely drank and didn't even smoke cigarettes except for one thing. He did smoke pot. He liked the feeling of relaxation he got from it, but he took it up a notch and developed a habit of taking a few hits of a joint before going diving. According to him, marijuana helped him stay focused on the task at hand. He thought he could perform better when he is high. So this had a direct correlation with cave diving. He believed with a little buzz he could be more aware of his surroundings, which can be highly helpful with cave diving. Also, as diving itself is a relaxing activity, Alton was able to double that feeling with pot. Just slowly swimming for hours, exploring and experiencing sights and places no other human had ever seen. He could almost lose track of time just floating. However, it was all fun and games until this one time he and his friends went exploring a new cave system that they had just found. So on that fateful day, Alton arrived at the dive site with a slight head cold. Instead of putting off the dive, he took some cold medicine and began preparing for the dive. So other than that, everything seemed normal. Once everybody was ready to set off, Alton as usual took a couple hits from a joint before getting in the water. Sometime into the dive, he and his friends separated to explore different sections of the cave system. When everyone got in groups of 2 or so, Alton decided to go alone to his section of the cave system. He wanted to map a narrow passage and didn't think there was room for more than one person in the space. The maximum depth of the dive was 100 feet. Alton was using mixed gas to lower the decompression requirements of the dive. That means when you go to a certain depth during the ascent, you have to stop multiple times along the way for your body to decompress. But with mixed gas, you can reduce the number of times you have to stop for decompression. Not only that, Alton placed 2 stage bottles inside the cave mouth behind a couple of rocks, so that when nearing the surface at the end of the dive, he could use them to decompress and off-gas the nitrogen that had accumulated in his body. The tanks contained a breathing gas mix with a high concentration of oxygen. However, the reason he didn't take those 2 gas tanks with him was because accidentally breathing from one at depth would cause him to have a seizure. Leaving them behind also kept him from having too large a load inside the narrow passageways. So basically, his plan was to descend to the bottom of the cave, explore his section, once done with it, do the ascent back to the cave mouth and use the air tanks behind those rocks to decompress. At least that is what he thought he will be able to do. Now it had been quite some time into the dive and Alton had made good progress. He had slowly moved, mapping everything he saw. In fact, he was already planning on what they would need to explore even deeper into the cave the next time. Once he was done with exploring, it was about time to surface. Alton reeled in his cave line as he swam. He glanced at the map he had sketched during the dive and smiled. He loved the feeling of getting there first and knew his buddies were going to be impressed. On the way nearing the surface, he remembered about the decompression stops. Although he didn't have to do as many, he still felt a bit lazy and frustrated to do them. By this point, he had pushed the dive a little too much, breathing into his reserve. Though he wasn't going to skip the decompression stops, he just thought if he was close enough to the stage bottles, he could start decompressing with them and get done with it quicker. The sooner he finds the bottles, the sooner he could surface. So he rounded a bend thinking it should directly lead him to the stage bottles and then the exit. But right as he was doing that, he took a breath, but he couldn't inhale any air. He was thunderstruck. In full confusion, he looked at his pressure gauge and realized he was out of air. His eyes darted forward. He looked around terrified, scanning the cave ahead for the 2 stage bottles and his decompression gas. Finding them was his only chance. They should be around here, he thought to himself, but they weren't. In reality, he had been making a fatal mistake this whole time. Alton was not where he thought he was. He hadn't made it back to the entrance yet. He was nowhere near where those 2 stage bottles were. In panic, Alton tried swimming forward as fast as he could, following the cave line, but he ran out of time and then the last remaining breathing gas he had in his tank. A few seconds later, he died right then and there. Rescue divers later recovered Alton's body about 150 feet below from where the decompression tanks were near the entrance to the cave. When his corpse was discovered, the tanks on his back were all empty. He thought marijuana gave him better focus, but in reality, it had done quite the opposite. He didn't realize he was running out of air until that last empty breath. So in conclusion, intoxication while diving is never ever a good idea. Villa had been diving on and off for over 10 years. Some years she dived frequently and others just a few times, but when it comes to the lobster season, she would always make it in the seawater. She was 44 years old and an overall competent diver with no known medical conditions. A long time ago, Villa and her dive buddy Dave had found a special spot where it was easier to find and catch lobsters. So this time also the two were super excited for the coming lobster hunting season. Their hunting spot was unique and hazardous. No one else thought to dive there because of the poor visibility, but the duo knew what they were doing as they had done it many times and also were the ones to find this special location in the first place. So the day of the underwater hunting journey came. Their plan was to catch their limit in 2 easy dives. So to get to their lobster spot, they made a shore entry and then swam out on the surface to a marker buoy where they began their dive. To make it easier to stay underwater at the shallow dive site, Villa was carrying 20 extra pounds of lead. She didn't want to have to worry about floating up and down with each breath or when waves passed overhead. So with that, the duo descended to a depth of over 15 feet in the seawater, filled their collection bags, and made it to the surface within moments of each other. The first dive of the day was uneventful but went just as planned. Although they were already expecting terrible visibility, that day it was even worse. They almost couldn't see anything. This made it difficult for the two to stay in contact with each other, but they reasoned it didn't matter that much. They were confident as they had dived together many times and weren't worried about being separated underwater. So before setting off for the second dive, they talked about their favorite ways to cook the lobsters they caught and made plans to invite friends over for a big party. Then the two friends pulled their wetsuits back on and entered the water to swim to the marker buoy. The surf and the wind had picked up during the surface interval, making the surfers swim harder. Villa swam to the buoy on her back. Due to the additional lead she was carrying, her buoyancy compensator was full. The pressure from the jacket-style buoyancy compensator made it hard for her to take a deep breath as she swam. If you guys don't know what a buoyancy compensator is, it is basically a type of diving equipment that is worn by divers to establish neutral buoyancy underwater and positive buoyancy on the surface when needed. The buoyancy is controlled by adjusting the volume of air in the bladder. In other words, simply, with it you can either float on the water or sink directly to the bottom. Alright, back to the story. so both Villa and Dave got pretty winded on the surface, which took them longer to get to the buoy. As soon as they got to it, both put on their regulators in their mouths, gave a quick signal to each other, and then began releasing air from their buoyancy compensators. Villa was slowly exhaling as she was sinking to the bottom of the sea. Between that and the extra weight she was carrying, she dropped to the bottom like a rock. Poor visibility and underwater surge caused the two friends to lose sight of each other immediately. Villa hit the sand in seconds at a depth of 13 feet. Dave, on the other hand, found it more difficult to reach the seabed, but he eventually managed. So with that, both started their hunt respectively. About 14 minutes later, Dave, as usual after finishing the dive, surfaced with a bag full of lobsters. He was pretty happy about it. By the time he was on the surface, he realized Villa hadn't finished her dive yet. He wasn't worried, the dive depth was very shallow, so he decided to wait. About 15 minutes passed. Now Dave began feeling a bit nervous. Though he still didn't presume anything going wrong, something like Villa running out of air was very unlikely. But what made him feel extremely tense is the time. Neither of them normally took that long to catch lobsters and return back to the shore. Dave waited another 15 minutes feeling absolutely horrified. By this point, he already knew. So he called for help and the search for Villa began. Not too long went by, the recovery divers discovered the corpse on the seabed 1.5 hours later, just 13 feet below the surface. The investigation found that Villa's air had never been turned on. Here's what had happened. When she got to the marker buoy, she was already out of breath from the swim. Then she let the air out of her buoyancy compensator before dropping out of sight. As she was sinking, she only exhaled, and she did it slowly until she reached the seabed. It only took seconds for her to hit the sand of the sea bottom. So once she was on the seabed, it was time for her to inhale after that long exhale she did during the descent. So she tried to take a full breath, but nothing came. Being out of breath in panic, she didn't realize she had forgot to turn on the air. The medical examiner ruled her death a drowning due to insufficient air. Alright guys, with that we have got to the end of today's two stories. Sadly, both ended tragically. Leave your thoughts about these two disasters down in the comment section, and also if you like my content, please consider subscribing to my channel. Alright then guys, that's all for now, and with another story, I will see you guys soon. Until then, stay safe out there and goodbye.